I can't find myself dilly-dallying too much. Yesterday, yes, I was supposed to make videos, but don't know how to put it, right? I think the best way to put it is can't hold my tongue to chase that focal down. No, I'm joking. It's funny, right? The camera turns on, and all of a sudden, the voice that I'd like to do all the time, I can't do it. That, and it's like in the morning. Um, so yeah, this video is called "America as Vehicle." America, what is it? Yeah, I didn't even take a screenshot of that. Funny, but America was a vehicle, as in rhetoric to ideology. I'm Frogbear. I like to think, and I put too much thought into a lot of things. So yeah, I like to write, and one of the very okay, I like to write, and one of the interesting things that happens with me writing, I write in a very peculiar fashion sometimes. It's because I have no other way of writing my notes. So the description I wrote American enterprise. I don't know why I can't say it. Like corporations, freedom of ventures, conquest, expansions. Those were the goals of imperialist expansion of the empire. They rewarded those who helped their acquisition of the lands. Yet in today's age, we do not see one central authority, and that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. Where um, there is a lack of understanding how would I say kingdoms um how kingdoms maintain themselves in the past. So I like to read a lot of weird not a lot of weird. It's just I like to read a lot. In terms of like novels, light novels or manga. And something that I've seen as a reoccurring theme recently within a lot of manga and manhwa, which is the Korean alternative, is their use of regression to the past, right? Like past lives. But and the gimmick here is that they retain their past memories. And so something that I see as a reoccurring theme is nation building, right? There are some mangas that are about nation building, and they talk about the importance of food, the importance of infrastructure, and various aspects of this, right? But there's always one person doing all these, implementing these solutions. And the reason why I always find that interesting is in doing so, right, it always requires the public. And there's always this notion that the character has to find a way to get the public on board with his ideas. Even if he's lordship, even if he's just kind of like the new kid in town, he'll get chummy with the mayor, whatever. Implement these new policies, which in a weird way, it's kind of like a form of tax revenue that then goes back into the public. And just seeing that really reminds me of what we see now with how corporations kind of handle themselves. I always remember a story where somebody was saying that it was cooler at some point in time to start your own company, start your own coding, right? To start your own software company or to start your own something. But now it isn't like that. Now it's more prevalent that you build your idea and then you sell it off to the corporation. And that's been a really reoccurring theme in just our modern history. Like I would say the last 20 years, where it's like build your company, build your brand, build your idea, and then sell it off. I'm not saying it's a good idea, but it is how people right now maintain themselves. I think my battery is dying. My, what do you call it? My little sun pack here. That? Yeah, it doesn't fix the little peach fuzz right here. Yeah, that's why you should recharge your batteries. But back to it. So the more I started thinking about how the population and how uh, people can put themselves into positions of power to then lead the public. Um, right? There always has to be some form of a guiding hand when innovations happen, when new strides of culture happen. You can usually pinpoint to what event or to what construction of what invention. So an example that I always like to use is the printing press, or at least its earlier forms of iteration. You discover that um, Cesare Borgia was somebody who shared the likeness of Jesus Christ. If you look into Cesare Borgia, he was the bastard son of a pope who was an organization by and large that, had access to the very earliest form of the printing press, because that was also around the time that we had the Reformation. We had, by and large, the publication of the Bible got bigger, et cetera, et cetera. Right, there are all these events that you can point to that allowed for the expansion. In this case, right, because the Bible was printed more, it led to an expansion of the literature, of Christian literature. And, you just look at Thomas Aquinas, look at the early theologian Christians that kind of push forward all that rhetoric. But there always was this form of central authority that the citizenry could see and visually capture, like, have an idea in their head and actually see that there are people there that did not have their own best interest in mind. And it wasn't not just their best interest in mind, but it was just that eventually it stopped being about building within their own borders and started being more of an issue of expansion. Right? They rewarded those who helped their acquisition of the lands. And a perfect example of this is Blackbeard's mentor. Like, Blackbeard had a real big gripe with him because he never wanted to attack any English ships. And that is one of those things where his mentor was probably rewarded enough by the English crown that he was just like, well, forever now I have complete loyalty to the English crown. And it was a notable thing with Blackbeard in his history that he had fights with his mentor, who was someone who was very loyal to the British crown. And that was kind of like a unspoken treaty on the seas where you couldn't attack any English ships, but you were more than willing to attack any French or Spanish ships. And if you know anything about that time period, that was the time that Florida was a Spanish colony, Los Angeles was a Spanish colony. Nobody likes to think it through, where if those were Spanish colonies, how did they become English colonies? At what point in time did that flip? Again, that comes with more of the obfuscation of the timeline and understanding what really occurred. But these were all expeditions led by some form of, ordership from the king, or it came from the Catholic Church, etc., etc. And people don't realize that, if we eat at the same places, drink the same food, partake in the same activities, by and large, we can consider ourselves peasants, like the lowest form of the class system. And even if you make yourself a more relevant position, it's still within the confines of the structure. If you become an engineer of any sort, if you become a construction worker of any sort, you administrative level work, it's still within the confines of the system, right? Basically, someone laid out the brick before you did. There's very little that you could do in the way that your predecessor could have done, because, right, these jobs that are there to maintain the infrastructure aren't necessarily there to expand or build or to innovate the infrastructure. Those sorts of jobs are usually delegated to inventors. But you know what I mean? Like, with the way that the intelligence apparatus works, I'd imagine that anytime anybody meaningful does any research in that, you'd find that that person becomes a very great interest to the nation, because when you have an innovator or an inventor, right, it's kind of the importance of the school of thought, the philosophy of sort of thing, because you realize that in order for you to have a genius or an innovator, certain forms of stimulus are required for that individual to really be allowed to kind of flourish into the flower that person should be. Um, you know, that's why I named the stream as specifically as I could, because we were the vehicle. We, by and large, are not, right? America was the vehicle, as in rhetoric to ideology. How do I explain where I got that thought from? As in rhetoric to ideology, right? Like, you can't explain the full concept of the idea or the ideology unless you have the words that go along with it. And that's what I considered America. America were those words that came along with building the bigger idea or the bigger concept. But what is lost is the fact that people think that was of their own natural volition. So to continue from where I left off in the description, yet we still see events of acquisition, yet we cannot see the hands who orchestrate these dealings, and the citizenry have believed themselves free from the governorship of lords, while brandishing the product of lords and distinguished families. Now that I'm actually just bringing reference to like Louis Vuitton, Gucci, Ferrari, these brands. If you look into what the definition of a hallmark is, hallmark to prove authenticity. The idea of a hallmark was like those wax seal stamps, or was the idea of having some form of certification that proved the authenticity of the product, or it proved the authenticity of that this product came from this kingdom, or this product was by this family or by that. So as we like to think that we do not have any form of like thought leaders or any form of empire leaders, we still, at least not me, but other people, brandish their clothes, brandish their brands, and hold these brands as far above anything else. And if you do any meaningful research, this always comes back to a really old video that it's called "The History of Those Who Rule Us." It's like a 6-hour long video, but in that video, somewhere along the way, the guy who's speaking in that video points out that all of these bigger brands like Heinz ketchup or like Kraft singles, like Kraft, I think that's under the Heinz family, or Seagram's. I think those are the two that I can use. Heinz is owned by Italian nobility. Seagram's is owned by Claire Brofman. I can't remember where the Brofmans are from, but she's like the princess of that empire or that venture capital. And then you look at the way trusts have formed themselves in this country, you can clearly see that there is a distinction that these families of affluence who held the legal deeds to their lands, they never disappeared. They just allowed themselves to be obfuscated by the financial system that was put forth. It gets more into it, right? So we like to think that we're free, but yet the way we maintain ourselves and the way we spend our dollar still kind of supports these families who are distinguished amongst ourselves. The citizens have been made to believe their course of action is of their own choice, unaware of how politics and policies are not merely just lip service. We like to believe that we had freedom of choice, freedom of the belief, freedom of the freedom to be allowed to create our own thoughts, and I don't think that's how it's played out in history. The way, you know what I mean? Like, for a great example is Pearl Harbor. Like, that was an event that forced the greater populace of Americans to do something. But it depends on what you know about that. It also depends on like the Zoot Suit riots. I like to point towards this because the Zoot Suit riots did not start in Los Angeles and did not start in California. And I really make this a big issue because it's relevant primarily for the fact that basically the initial Zoot Suit riots started in San Antonio. Right? This is World War II. Yet they expect me to believe that where the most violent part of the Zoot Suit riots occurred was in Los Angeles. But there are a few holes in this idea where the Navy men had left one of the ports from their place. So they were at sea. Catch my drift, right? These sailors were at sea. Yet, when they were traveling towards California to make their next pit stop, along that way, newspapers were delivered to these men on the ship. And these newspapers were clearly angled towards one way, and it was a pro-propaganda piece for war. But it was there primarily to instill division amongst whoever was on the ship and those Mexicans living in Los Angeles, because it was a clothing shortage or whatever, because Mexicans didn't want to give up, right? Because we were dressing in a very peculiar fashion. It required a lot of extra clothing, and because of that extra clothing, the government was asking for more of the clothes, but It basically started this whole division thing with men who were out at sea, who were delivered a specific newspaper that then allowed them to be angry, thus allowing whatever egregious bullshit that happened at the streets of LA. But again, people are forgetting that there was a newspaper company that delivered these papers. I don't know, I'm not suggesting that they knew exactly that these papers were going to get to these sailors, but somebody made the deliberate choice of giving these sailors these specific papers that then riled them up in order to go to LA, find these people, and beat them up. But the way I see it is, the way history played out, we know more about the Los Angeles event and less about the San Antonio event. And the reason why we know less about the San Antonio event is because of there are more external factors that we need to consider. One, the FBI was involved in the San Antonio raids. Two, those largely had to do with banking issues, as in somebody was trying to move money to Mexico to move to a different country, and that country we were at war with. And if you know anything about Prescott Bush, or at least George Bush Sr.'s father, and what he got caught with, which was essentially trying to deliver money to the Germans at the time. And it leads to national security, He got his banks foreclosed or seized from the government. Very weird stuff. But again, it all goes back to the weird obfuscation of certain areas, because it wouldn't have allowed for the citizens to mobilize. It would not have allowed for these various instances that they can then build off rhetoric from. People like to say, at least my people, Mexicans, whatever, Latinos, they like to say like, oh, this is why you should hate white people and this and that. And I'm just like, dude, no, like the people on the ship had nothing to do with it. There were other deliberate choices that were made before they made their decision. So it's kind of like whoever held the karma for that whole thing is not any of the soldiers. They're just idiots. They're just idiots caught up in whatever decision was made. And then the later, by the later I mean later in time, you'll have other activists who will use these events as lip service in order to portray this idea that we were that we were suppressed somehow. And it's like, nah, the way I see it, at least that Mexican population of Zoot Suit people were not, they weren't giving into the war rhetoric. And because of that, World War II was very necessary in order for this plan to progress. But how do you get people to join a war that they do not want to join? You have to create a psyop, right? You have to create these events, these markers of stimulus in order for other people to make their decision, right? They won't just jump off the cliff. Gotta create the circumstances for them to want to jump off the cliff, is how a propagandist would see it. So, by and large, I feel like people don't understand how susceptible they are to to the cogs of the machine, they like to think, oh no, we're free. Why am I supposed to think that they don't have my best interest at mind and this and that? And it's just like, well, with the way, all right, so this was the Franco-Syrian War that I like to talk about as of more recently, is the fact that we can clearly see that the pipeline through Syria and the acquisition of these oil states was not propagated by us. This was not even World War II yet. Like, none of this had occurred yet, is what you're failing to understand. These were the beginning dominoes that were placed. The last one would be the crashing or the destruction of two pillars. And right, that whole ritual for spellcraft. So I find it very odd to believe that people are like, oh no, I made my decisions purely on my accord. I have my opinions purely of my own accord. And it's like, no. Like, everything you've decided in life has been planned or dictated not by yourself, but by the people who have orchestrated our system the way it is. We learn what we learn because we're allowed to learn it. We know of the wars that we know of, and we know of them the way we're supposed to know of them because our empire won. Everything our empire has written is entirely for the benefit of our empire. And kind of a good example of this is, so as of right now, we assume that the liberals are in control. We assume that the people who wave the rainbow-colored flag are in control of our system. They're in control of our cultural paradigm. And supposedly it has been this way since 2018. Right? We can assume that they took over the colleges. They had a complete grip of control at the highest time in 2018 because the rhetoric was still not smashed the way it was. Yet, I always brought it up as a point of contention that if these people are in control, then why can I still go to the store and buy a brand new Hitler book? Why can I still go to these various other locations and buy Mein Kampf? If supposedly these people hate these other group of people, then why are we allowed their literature? Why are we allowed their history? Why are we... It gets into this whole other point of, if what you say is true, then why can I still purchase X, Y, and Z? And the reason that matters is because they're not really in control. Like, don't be fucking retarded. Like, if they were really in control, none of these other things would still be allowed or accessible to the hands of the public. Because, you know, we get into the school of thought and we get into why it's important to control what sort of ideas come into the imagination or into the head of others. You'd imagine that they would want to stop these ideas at its root, but yet they can still buy these things. You could still find this on the internet, and you could still, like, what's the point? I thought they were in control. I thought they hated this aspect of history, but yet I could still buy it in mass. I know people that could still buy all of the memorabilia from this time period, from these hated group of people, yet, right, there's no question being asked of, if it's true that our system is controlled, then why are you allowed to purchase these products? Why are you allowed to have this idea still? I thought they would have cut it off at the end of World War II, right? There would have been more meaningful barriers of entry towards this information. Yet, clearly, if you go on the internet, it is the only, right, public forums. I don't know. Anytime I'm in a public forum, I always see how highly the Germans are spoken of on these threads and on these forums, and I'm just kind of like, you're allowed to have this school of thought. You're allowed to exist as the boogeyman for the other side, and you don't see this. Like, you don't see how, right, like, there is a form of a lord or of somebody who's giving sponsorship, handing out these materials, handing out these forms of weaponry, handing out these ways of supplying an alternative Died already. Yet people like to think that, oh no, I made my own conclusions. I made my own thought process, and it's just like I don't think you know what that means. I don't think you understand that. You know what I mean? I think if anybody understands the importance of information and knowing what they could allow their public and not and not right, if they're already deciding to ban certain books from schools, from publication, from circulation, yet the biggest so-called enemy is Nazis, then why can you still buy all of their books? Why can you still learn about all of these events in history? And I don't know. Growing up, right? Here's the weird part. Growing up, I knew somebody. Castro, shout out to Castro if you're watching this. Um his name is Jose Castro, yeah. He collected quite a bit of Nazi memorabilia when we were growing up, right? This is like a Mexican cat, and he's super into it. And at the time, I didn't think much of it. But it's not just him. There were metalheads, punk heads. I met a lot of people who owned this memorabilia and like really fetishized it. Not fetishized it in the way of like, ooh, I'm gonna touch myself, but more fetishized it in the way of like, yeah, look at my precious collection. And I didn't see a problem with it because I'm just like, whatever, you're into wartime memorabilia. That's like not that big of an issue. But to see our culture develop the way it has, and to see develop this war that we have between the left right paradigm, when they're cut from the same cloth. Both of these extremists are cut from the same cloth of ideology. And it reminded me of that quote Edwin Black said, which is National Socialism is something the means of socialism. It was just the means. Like, we were going to enact these things anyways. Like, we just decided to use this veneer of ideology in order to push it forward. So, as with Pearl Harbor, it being the event that catalyzed and pushed forward the American Empire in a weird way, I wouldn't say that. I would go as far back as to somewhere along the way during pre-colonial times. It was very well known what kind of capabilities the American Empire had, right? And because of that, they basically saw the same thing happen with what they saw Germany happen to, which was fully knowing that the Germans were about to have so much free capital, so much free enterprise in the sense of their capabilities of producing were going to be so high that they decided to stop that and nip it at the bud. And they were like, no, you've gone way too far. We can't put a hold on you. Da 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 da. Right? Because they were already gearing for the machine to go a certain way. And it was kind of required for Germany to fall in line because, you know, it goes back into the pipeline of where's the current state of Germany when it comes to natural oil or natural gas. Oh, they have a dependence to the Russian Empire? Oh, why is that problematic? Well, maybe because the Europeans have been trying to create their own pipelines in the Middle East to diminish their need and dependence on what empire? Right? Like, these are just the things that have been repeating since the 1900s. It's been 100 years later, and they're still fighting about the same bullshit. Think? Hello? No thinky? Thinky. And you know, it goes down to why, instead of them, right, because they couldn't get the citizens to fight for anything meaningful, they decided to create ideologies for people to believe in to then fight for what they should believe in. Does that make sense? Right? It's no longer about the desires or the needs of the people that are motivating the people. Now it's what they believe to be the things that are motivating and desiring them. So when you think that's what you need, you're more caught up in that idea and that paradigm. And I think that's why the dependence of supermarkets, stores, and them industrializing the way that they did everything was just various other ways of obfuscating your needs. Instead of you farming, now you can buy it. Instead of you doing this, you could do this. It just became a misdirection of our lifestyles. And yet, people like to assume, again, that their decisions, their thoughts, and their beliefs are of their own volition. And I'm like, nah, Dougie, nah. They've controlled our education system from the very beginning. The Ford, the Rockefeller, the Carnegie Institution, all of them from the very beginning decided and molded the entire infrastructure we see today the way it is. And, it goes down to, I always find it baffling that one statistic where somebody was, you could get all the people of the world and still fit them at the top of Texas, right? Like, you don't need any more than that. Everybody could live right side by side, all right there, and the whole world is still okay. But it goes into, there has never been any meaningful amount of attempts into renovating the country, into renovating or expanding any of these other areas, or into creating more efficient or better systems. That has never been a thing. The only time that they've ever built stuff that's efficient or useful or in terms of infrastructure, it was only ever to benefit a certain ecclesiastical class. And beyond that, it was never meant to benefit anybody else beyond that. Right? They molded the world into their liking, not into what's more efficient, into what works best. It was into their liking, into the way they wanted things. So, this is why I have a gripe with like black pillars and people who consider themselves based and red pilled. It's just like, I think you grossly misunderstand the issues at hand just because you think that this world was designed by you or built by you, or because you think it was built with efficiency in mind. You think that it was designed for it to be this magical thing, and it's like, it's not how it played out. Like, if anything, it's played out pretty terribly, all because of the lack of acknowledgement from certain people that their decisions ultimately allowed for the world to develop the way it is. It's like, yes, we could point to whatever magical skin color magically invented all these other things, but when you get down to it, well, then who made the decisions to destroy this lovely country? Wasn't. It was largely your people, because they were ideologically motivated and ideologically driven by rhetoric in order for the course of action to change. So, yes, you could play lip service to how great whatever group of people could be, but when it comes down to rhetoric and ideology, any people could be destroyed quite easily. We could look at the Ottoman Empire. We could look at the Russian Empire. We could look at the various squabbles that the Romans found themselves in. Rhetoric always took them too far. And whatever ideology kept being pushed forward just took everything else too far, right? Eventually, having the ideas of the perfect man and the perfect body developed into these really weird ideas of having sex with men. And that all occurred within the Roman Empire. From it stopped being a Roman Empire to going into the Byzantine Empire. But, whatever. I just want to stay with my rose-tinted glasses about the Romans. And it's just like, nah, dog. It happens everywhere. Like, eventually, you'll have somebody in various instances of history who understand the rhetoric in a very different way to get the people to make decisions to push forward into a different direction because they deemed it so that everybody else should live this way. So it comes down with the idea of let's take this idea a bit more modern and look at how contraception was pushed forward. contraception was pushed forward by the Rockefeller Institute and their cohorts in the medical industry, and the medical industry was their creation. The medical education system was their creation. All forms and aspects of this were their creation, largely because they wanted to control the reproduction of people. They wanted to control the means of production in a weird way. But because the way they see it is, these are our drones, these are our workers. But instead of them deciding to cut it off completely because they need the workers, it went more into this dystopian Brave New World aspect where, well, we're going to poison you. And we're going to poison you in these very specific ways so that your body chemistry turns out in such a way where you're incapable of thought, you're incapable of feeling, you're incapable of doing anything yourself, that to some degree now you need hand-holding. And it gets down to that thing that I spoke about my brother-in-law, where I look at my brother-in-law be so skillful in all the things he has, but yet when it comes down to the dreaded word of college, he then becomes this inferior person. And I'm just like, college people wish they could learn what you know, what you've decided to learn on your off time. But yet we've attached this really weird value to the word college graduate when it doesn't mean what you think it means. It just means you walked away with 6 figures of debt. It just means that you decided to take a education from this specific institution who might not even have professors that taught you anything meaningful, might have professors that didn't even meaningfully prepare you for what you were about to experience in the real world. But yet, my brother-in-law and various other people find themselves always demeaning themselves, degrading themselves into these very small form factors because I didn't do this, I didn't live this life, or I didn't do this, or I didn't distinguish myself in this capacity. So that means I must be the bottom of the barrel. And I'm just like, meanwhile, he's soldering in the back, creating this whole these letters, putting lights in them, soldering them, getting the electricity and the voltage to flow the correct way, and all this other shit. And I'm just looking at him like, you think you're stupid? Like, there's a whole new generation of people from my age below who don't even know how to do anything of what you just did. And he self-taught himself how to do all that within 6 months. I'm like, yeah. Funny how people tend to believe these weird abstractions of themselves. But I'm going to continue this series, America Was a Vehicle. Because I couldn't really, I came out with all these other ideas and had all these other kind of topics that I wanted to touch on and really kind of pinpoint to. But I probably shouldn't have started this off as my first video today, but very heavy thoughts. I got to a lot of it, and I think I got to the basic gist of it. And the reason why I wanted to continue this series is because shout out to Pox. Pox basically sent me this video of somebody who maintains the event structure from the beginning of the year towards whenever he makes an update, and he's been adding and collecting these fires that happen at these various infrastructure points. And what I would call infrastructure point is do you produce goods, milk, raw goods? Do you process the raw good, and does that raw good then get used at other factories? Factories, processing plants, or storage units, or any of those kind of things that exist for other portions of companies and organizations to exist. Those you would call points of construction or points of infrastructure, because even a parking lot for trucking is a point of is an infrastructure point. And we have been seeing a lot of these weird fires. They've been reoccurring since last year, and we've seen an uptick in how these various points of infrastructure have been targeted. So in a little bit, I'm going to give myself a bit of a break to wind down my brain a bit. And then I'm going to bring up Pox's video. Yesterday I just got stuck. Yeah, I don't know how to explain it. I saw somebody's video. thought their topic was interesting, considering I'm a guy, and that doesn't the video discussion did not really, it wasn't really relevant to me. But it reminded me of a video that I got recommended, but I did not watch. And then I watched the video, and I got stuck in my head. I'm very imaginative, and you know what I mean? You know, everybody wants to believe that some fantasies are real, but some might be too good to be true, you know what I mean? Either way. We'll see if I can fix this light or change the batteries.